All right, we're going to continue with feedback mechanisms. We talked about how do we really need a feedback mechanism in order to monitor our ongoing speech. And we said there are four kinds of feedback control: an auditory feedback control, a tactile feedback control, a proprioceptive, and then a central neural or internal feedback mechanism. We in our previous part we discussed about the auditory and the tactile feedback, and we said auditory is something that we hear and tactile is something that we feel, the sense of touch. And we said that both of these mechanisms, auditory and tactile, are more so an external feedback mechanism, and auditory is after the fact, and do auditory and tactile actually monitor a skilled ongoing speech production, or does it work after the fact? Okay, so we're going to also, we said that they one additional thing that I would want to add for auditory and tactile is that they do not provide information about the muscle activity per se. So in order for us to be able to monitor ongoing feedback, what is it something that we might use as a system that provides us to correct as we are moving our articulators? So that's called the proprioceptive feedback. The meaning of proprioceptive feedback is that we get direct feedback from the muscles. Okay, so what does it do? When we are producing our speech, the proprioceptive feedback allows us to sense the velocity, meaning the speed, the direction of the movement, and position of the body structures. Here, in terms of body structures, I'm not talking about very broad, we're talking about structures involved in articulation. So, the muscle contraction as we move our tongue, the muscle contraction as we move our lips, all of this is what happens to those specific muscles. How fast are those muscles moving? In what direction are they moving? Forward, lateral, posterior? What is the movement of direction of movement, and where is the position of these body structures? There are sensors in joints that transmit information about bone angles. This is specifically, we're talking about like the broad structures. There are receptors along tendons that respond to muscle contractions, and they transmit data about muscle stretching and shortening. So let's break this down. It sounds like a lot of physical therapy related or sports medicine related, where we're talking about receptors, we're talking about tendons, we're talking about muscle contractions. When a muscle contracts, there is actually shortening of the muscle because there's an overlap of two proteins, the myosin and the troponin. Okay, so two proteins that kind of overlap, actin and myosin that overlap, and actin and myosin that overlap, and it's called the sliding filament theory. I can talk more about this, but really this is not the place to talk about it. But I just want to mention that there are the shortening and stretching and shortening of the muscle is sensed because we get a direct feedback from these muscles, and that will tell us, are we in the right position that we need to be in order to achieve our output, which is our ongoing speech. Okay, so let's break this down. Proprioceptive feedback is direct feedback from the muscle. So what does it do? It is monitoring how much our muscles contract, how much our muscle stretches, and when that happens, how much is the movement, like what is the direction of movement of the muscle, what is the position of these muscles in the mouth, and what is the speed of movement of these muscles. So if you observe yourself talking and actually feel there is a lot of movements that's happening in my speech, and as I'm talking, I'm just kind of paying attention to my muscle movements. There is a lot of coordination that's happening between my respiratory muscles, my phonatory muscles, and my articulatory muscles, right? And that sense is what, that feedback is what is called proprioceptive feedback. Okay. There is something called, when we talk about muscle fibers, right, there is something called a muscle spindle. Okay, a muscle spindle is actually parallel to the main muscle fiber. When we talk about, in general, neurons, we talked about afferent neurons and efferent neurons, right? Afferent neurons are neurons that helps in sensation, meaning carries sensation of touch, of pain, of temperature to the central nervous system. Efferent neuron is the motor response. How do we respond when we actually touch fire, right? The sensation, as soon as we touch a fire, is the afferent neuron carrying that it's hot, the efferent neuron says move away your hand. Okay, that's the motor response. So in terms of speech, if we talk about it, sensation is, say for example, if you went to a dentist's office, right, and they numb a certain area of your teeth, say to do some kind of treatment, it also kind of creates a very sluggish movement of your tongue and your jaw. So when that happens, you are not able to feel as much your movement of the tongue. That's why they say don't swallow, don't drink any water for the next 2 hours, because you really can't feel your mouth moving or swallowing food. So they ask you to just wait a couple hours before you actually start drinking water, right? The efferent is making an extra effort. Your tongue requires more work, so you're getting information from the central nervous system. Move your tongue a little bit more so you can have a precise articulation. Okay, so that's the afferent and efferent. So efferent is motor, afferent is sensory. So a way that I remember when I was a student is me, motor, efferent, as afferent, sensory. Okay. All right. Now these muscle spindle, what do they do? The purpose of the muscle spindle is actually to provide rapid feedback to the central nervous system about changes in the muscle length and the rate of change. So we talked about the velocity, we talked about the contraction, stretching and contracting, right? So the muscle spindle is the one that actually has receptors that senses these changes about muscle length and rate of change, and it provides feedback to the central nervous system. The amount of feedback, the velocity of feedback that is required, is given, conveyed to the central nervous system is about 120 meters per second. That is pretty fast, rapid. So some people predict that this is a mechanism for control of ongoing speech. So as you're producing, the muscle spindle is recognizing stuff and is providing feedback to the central nervous system. So if any changes need to be made, it will be made in order to correct your ongoing speech. Hence, they say that probably proprioceptive feedback is a possible feedback mechanism for ongoing speech. Okay, so what did we talk so far? We talked about what proprioceptive feedback is. We said that proprioceptive feedback is receiving direct information from the muscle per se. How does it receive information from the muscle per se, or what kind of information? The kind of information it receives is the velocity of movement of these muscles, the direction of movement of these muscles, and the position of these muscles in the body. How does the central nervous system receive such feedback? It's because of the presence of receptors in something called the muscle spindle, which runs parallel to the main muscle fiber. These muscle spindles have afferent and efferent neurons. The afferent is when it provides rapid feedback. It takes this feedback quickly from the periphery, from your articulators in terms of muscle length and the rate of change of the muscle to the central nervous system. The speed of feedback is so rapid, that is 120 meters per second, that some people predict that this is a possible feedback mechanism for ongoing speech. Now, researchers have tried a lot of things, and they say that it's very difficult to actually investigate proprioceptive feedback in speech. It's simple in terms of large muscles. You can talk about muscle contraction in terms of your biceps moving, or in terms of your triceps moving, or your knee bending, things like that. These are broad-based muscles. But in terms of speech, these muscles are very small, and the researchers have had difficulty in terms of investigating specific proprioceptive feedback in speech. But they have done some studies like perturbation studies. What is perturbation studies? Perturbation is when you are interfering with the normal positional articulatory relationships. So for example, if I placed a pen or a bite block or any kind of prosthesis in my mouth, okay? So when I still place that and I'm able to produce some kind of speech. So for example, here, I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, I had a pen in my mouth as I did that. Would you say that the speech was intelligible or unintelligible? Okay. When we place such bite blocks in our mouth, or anything that interferes with our normal articulatory position, which is this, the compensation is almost immediate. Meaning, it's a very unconscious or a subconscious compensation. So when I placed the pen in the mouth versus without the pen in the mouth, you could still understand what I was trying to say. So if I place a white block in my mouth, my compensation is almost immediate. I have a pen in my mouth. You can tell that I'm not really actually having a true articulatory movement But, oh, okay, I was almost gagging. I had to take that out. But I could place a pen in the mouth and you could understand what I was trying to say. Okay, so these perturbation studies indicate that at a subconscious level or an unconscious level, there is a compensation that is almost immediate. And what could be this result of this immediate compensation is a combination of your proprioceptive feedback, right? Because your muscles are adjusting itself. And two, maybe it's a combination of tactile feedback. And also it's a combination that they say this is an already learned movement, right? Your speech is so fine, it's a learned movement, so it can be performed without proprioceptive feedback. But also, think about this. If I place this and the compensation is almost immediate, how would I learn, for example, a learned movement versus a new learning movement? So, for example, if you're teaching somebody a new articulatory position of, this is a classic example that I give, is foreign speakers cannot say thank you, which is the TH in your thank you, while non-foreign speakers will say thank you or thank you, which is like the alveolar TH or a slightly palatal T, right? When I am teaching those new occurrence of sounds, thank you, I'm saying that I'm placing my tongue in between my teeth. So I would probably require tactile feedback, auditory feedback, and proprioceptive feedback to learn this new movement. But if it's something that I've already learned, a perturbation of placing a bite block in my mouth should not really impair that existing movement because the muscle adjustment is rapid and unconscious. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So what we're talking about here is I'm comparing these three feedback mechanisms. I'm comparing an auditory feedback, tactile feedback, and proprioceptive feedback. Proprioceptive feedback is internal. It's not relying on an output that you hear or that you feel. It's internal. It's controlled by the muscle spindles. It's controlled by the neurons. So you're not really doing a voluntary control. It's more so an automatic control. That is proprioceptive feedback. It's more an internal control mechanism. While your auditory and your tactile are more an external feedback mechanism because it relies more so after the fact, and they are external peripheral organs that are placing this feedback than the muscle input per se. Okay. The final feedback that we're going to talk about is an internal feedback mechanism. The internal feedback relies on information within the brain about the motor commands before the motor response itself. So there are circuits, the theorists believe that the circuits in the brain, within the brain that connects the different lobes, that connects the different areas in the brain, have a loop that will talk about motor response before you actually produce the response. So if there is any correction that needs to happen, it actually happens at the level of the brain. So there is an internal feedback or an internal check at the level of the brain. Feedback of this type is possible because in addition to the feedback that your auditory and tactile mechanism or your proprioceptive is giving, there are loops that are central and entirely within the brain. But a lot of people believe in this because speech is so fine that you can't just rely only on auditory feedback, tactile feedback, or proprioceptive feedback, but you need to have these certain loops in the brain to correct certain mechanisms that happen. But unfortunately, there is only theoretical talk, but there is no evidence of how the internal feedback happens in the brain. Okay, so we believe that there's probably a communication between your cerebellum, your cerebrum, your basal ganglia, your thalamus, your areas in the brain, that this loop within the brain will correct for any kind of movement errors that could happen. And it doesn't have to come to the periphery at all. But there is no evidence to say how these things happen. Nobody has gone into the brain to put electrodes or to measure what the loops are. Okay, but considering how speech is so complex, so fine, it's not gross, but it's so fine that you need more than just the auditory and tactile and the muscle feedback. You need something more than that, and possibly it happens at the level of the brain. Okay, so to sum, in today what we talked about proprioceptive feedback and an internal feedback mechanism. The proprioceptive and internal feedback mechanism are more internal than external, meaning to say that it happens more central to your brain. So your proprioceptive is from the muscle, and the compensation is almost immediate or automatic or unconscious when you have any interference to the normal articulatory position. And since speech is so fine, it involves so much fine motor movements that the feedback doesn't just rely on your muscle movement or an external feedback, which includes your auditory and tactile, but it requires something more, and possibly it happens within the level of the brain. But again, unfortunately, there is no evidence for the loops that are within the central nervous system to support this speculation. So, let's just sum what is the role of feedback in speech production. The more central the system, right, which includes your internal feedback and your proprioceptive feedback, the feedback information can be more effective, and it can be helpful for ongoing control of rapid and complex motor patterns. So I'm talking about systems like the muscles and your brain. Even before your output is made, the corrections are made so that you don't have a wrong speech output. But the more peripheral your system, which includes your auditory and tactile, it only happens after the motor response has been executed. So, for example, after I've said as I said, my classic example of my V and W, the V and the W, right? These two sounds, I can only correct them after I've actually produced them in terms of like the tactile feel that helps me differentiate between those two sounds. So for ongoing, we require an internal and proprioceptive feedback, and they're more central to the system. While for learning new patterns, so for example, if I wanted to learn thank you, right, I can use my tactile feedback and I can use my auditory feedback to see if I'm hearing the thank you or the thank you. So I can use those external feedback so I know I have to match my output to the intent of my production. So those I will use my auditory and tactile feedback. Okay. I know this is a lot of information, but if you sit down and kind of categorize these in terms of what is one that you hear after the fact, so which is auditory after the fact, and the feedback that you receive from tactile is after the fact, after the execution of the actual motor output, while your proprioceptive and internal are something that is ongoing, that will help us change our patterns as we are producing our speech, so that we don't wait till we have made the error to actually receive feedback. Okay. So what this gives is a conceptualization of the feedback systems available to the speaker. So if you look at this, here is my central nervous system, right? There are motor commands within the central nervous system that will help us understand or make modifications even before the motor output is executed. So that's internal feedback. Now, if I look at this section, the middle section, right, there's the efferent neurons which provide motor input, and afferent neurons which take back proprioceptive feedback here. The muscle activity, the muscle movements at the level of respiratory, laryngeal, articulatory system will carry back my through the muscle spindles to the afferent neurons. It takes back about information about my speed of movement, the position, the direction of movement of the muscle. Here is my output that happens when I produce it. The output comes in terms of auditory output, which is a sound wave, so auditory feedback goes back. Here is in terms of the movements, how I move. That's the tactile feedback that goes back to my central nervous system. So my external feedback is my movement and my tactile feedback and my auditory feedback. My response, my proprioceptive and my internal feedback are my internal feedback mechanisms, which are closer to the central nervous system and helps in ongoing control. Okay, so there are 4 feedback mechanisms: auditory, tactile, proprioceptive, and internal. Auditory and tactile are helping us in terms of after the fact, after the execution of motor movement, you have this feedback to help us correct so we can meet the actual intent of what we wanted to produce. Proprioceptive feedback is taking information from the muscles per se through the muscle spindles, which acts as receptors, which have both efferent and afferent neurons, which carries proprioceptive feedback to the central nervous system. Internal feedback is within your central nervous system. Within the brain, you have connections that help us identify what kind of information needs to be changed in order to produce what our original intent is. All right. Just take a look at this, and I want you to give me information about, give me one example of learning a motor task wherein you would use an auditory and a tactile feedback. for speech. So I'm talking about a new activity where you would probably use an auditory feedback and a tactile feedback to learn a new motor speech movement. Okay, that probably would be in a discussion board. I'm asking you to think about, like, for example, for me, it'll be my th or the v. That's a new sound that I would want to hear and I would want to produce, and so I'm using the auditory and a tactile feedback to learn that new production of that speech sound. So give me one example where you'd probably think will be a good idea to use auditory feedback and external, to rely on the external feedback mechanism. So you can learn new speech motor movements for speech. Okay,